Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Well, welcome to the afternoon session of Active Publications. This session is, in this session we are trying to sort of increase awareness about how the publication format should be changed and what are the approaches that can be leveraged in changing the publication format. Increasingly, there are a number of researchers who have become interested in reproducible science. There is an active community of e-publishing where research papers are being made online. And I think most of us now access most of these publications. Instead of going to the libraries, we go on search engines and download the publications. But there is still that a publication is still, as David Donoho says, just a marketing. It's just an explanation of the idea. One doesn't get to know how data sets could be associated with it, or get into the depths of the scientific method that the researcher has taken in the paper. So we have two talks. One talk is the first talk. I'll be presenting a framework in which we have tried to look at how we can use some of the computational approaches in making a better or more approachable paper for the readers and reviewers. And then after my talk, Ian Foster would be giving a talk on how we can use cloud computing to support such infrastructures. So I'll be presenting Sole, which is the rising sun in Italian. And we are hoping that this would shed light on the currently opaque papers. The idea is to link research papers with science objects. And this is joint work with Quan Pham and Ian Foster. And we are all at the University of Chicago. So I would like to start with that of the boon of computational science, which was reported in this report to the president in 2005, that it's a unique window which is changing the way we are thinking about science. It is tackling otherwise impractical and impossible to address problems, and it is making things which were very expensive and time consuming. Now it's making that process much more efficient. And sort of this report is details about how computational science can change the world in which we are living. But 7 years down the line, and increasingly I think it would be in the next few years again, there is the scourge of computational science which is coming up. And the scourge is that the inputs to computational science can no longer be linked to its outputs. So we have large quantities of data, complex data manipulation or numerical simulation software. We use distributed software stacks. So any of this code, data, and execution, none of these can be linked to our primary output through which we come to know about the science, which is research papers. These are text-based and totally non-interactive right now. Another big sort of problem is that most of the, there are two sort of actors in this paper. One are the authors and the other are readers. Authors are approaching the whole problem from the software stack or the software and the code basis, whereas readers are first looking at the paper and then coming and then sort of wanting to know about the code data. So their directions in which they are approaching the scientific method is opposite. And we need to sort of get them into a happy medium where both could coexist. And for most authors, it's a post hoc association of the inputs to the outputs. It never comes that while they're working, they are thinking about how they would do the reproducible science. Now, it's enough to sort of talk about this. I want to sort of give some concrete examples from real papers as to showing you how things are totally non-reproducible. So this is a computational paper, and this is taken from a paper that was following a master's thesis. It's in the area of climate in the area of climate science, and the person has this paper where the person meant it's very small, but I have sort of tried to highlight the important point is uses two input data sets to has a particular model, and then sort of runs the model on those data sets and puts an image out. And when the paper is written, the person marks some particular dates, produces a table over here, uses some sort of values of how the thing was configured, and then produces the output image. Now, there is no way in which a new user or a graduate student can go and rerun this analysis and regenerate this image as of now. So that's a purely computational paper, which we cannot repeat the results. The second is a policy paper, and this is again from the climate science domain. And so with this, in this paper, we sort of worked with the student who had written the paper, and this paper sort of comes up with a model of pricing of electricity and water resources. Now, those are very important commodities for us. So anyone who has to look at the cost model as to how the pricing of electricity and water model should be done would want to verify all the particular sort of values that have been used in this paper from the other resources. And so in this paper, the person said that if you look at the red lines, that a significant subsidy for wind power in Texas, and so he sort of uses this value 10 gigawatt target. And this 10 value is very important in the pricing model, and cites the page, gives a reference to that. If you go to that reference, then it's a sort of cited reference to a web page, which is a snapshot of which I have taken from here. So we can see that for Texas, there is something listed, but there is nothing 10 over here. So which value has the person taken? Possibly, the truth is that the existing value 9727 was actually approximated and was used as 10 gigawatts. But the citation is a blank citation to this particular web page, where it's very difficult to find out how the value was taken. Similarly, in this policy paper, since it's a policy paper, there are, I can give you the actual links. Oops. Okay, sorry about that. So in this paper, the person has collected values from so about 50 other sources. The student has looked into those values. And some of the values come on the 50th page of a PDF. So these are energy reports that the US government releases, and they'll come on the 50th page. On the 75th page, there would be a graph, and so a particular value has been extracted from that graph, and those values have been mentioned in this paper. It's very hard to while reading the paper for readers to know where did this value come from. They know the source, but it's where was the value in that paper. These are data mining papers, and they have been taken from PubChem. These papers have been cited by PubChem as important papers which have been using large amounts of PubChem data for their analysis. So these are two different papers, and I can give you the links if a person is more interested in seeing. So the first paper talks about this NCI 60 data set, and as I show, it says it is publicly available. but if somebody goes and searches for NCI 60 on PubChem, on Google, on Bing, anywhere, the NCI 60 would not come up. Then it sort of says that we took the top 60 bioassays in this data. So what we did was, sorry, I'll just back up a little bit. So we took the, it says that it is publicly available in the PubChem bioassay database as 73 bioassays with the name of NCI human tumor cell line growth inhibition assay under the DTP/NCI data source. And so I'm not a biologist. I contacted 2 graduate students in the biology department and asked them, can you search for this data set? And they did with NCI 60. They could not find any of the NCI 60 data set. Then they searched with this particular NCI human tumor cell line growth inhibition assay on PubChem, and they found 75 of those bioassays for a particular date of December 9th, 2010, which is when it was downloaded. Now, they took top 60 bioassays with the maximum number of compounds, but we don't know which were the top 60 bioassays that were selected because we found 75 instead of 73. Now, if you go, they say that this data was downloaded from this site. If you go to that site, it's a scramble. It's very difficult to find out what were the bioassays. It's just a simple file listing directory. Similarly, for the second paper, the reader sort of states that this bioassay was stored on this particular date for these many compounds. And if you go and look at that particular revision number for the bioassay that was stored, you would find around 50,000 compounds instead of 47,000 compounds. So it's very difficult as to know what were the particular compounds that were selected. Now, let me sort of also say that the data sources that they were downloaded are included in the papers. So one may say that, well, the data set is there. But it's for most of the graduate students and researchers, they want to start afresh from the PubChem side. They don't sort of just want to take the data set and work with that. They say that we'll go to the PubChem site and we will try to download the same data set again. And then it's like, they have to also verify from this data set as to see whether each particular element that they are thinking is that included or not. So they just want to go on the main original data source and start from there. So these are just sort of some examples as to where sort of people want to know more about data sets or computational products or sort of executions of things that appear in the paper. So as sort of I have sort of in between mentioned that the current state of the art is that we have digital repositories. PubMed has many, like about 21 million abstracts. There are open access journals such as PLOS ONE, Biomedical Central. But for most of the cases, authors would just provide email addresses. In some cases, authors would create some kind of objects, like they would share the code or data through a website, make some software packages available, or if the author is very, very inclined, would create a virtual image. But what we think is that even if you do that, they're still loosely connected with the claims and findings in the paper. They don't sort of give a very good idea about how the things were done when a person is reading the paper. So it sort of creates what I think this push and pull between authors and readers. That reader would sort of send an email, and author would reply, in 10 days, and the reader would not know what needs to be done, and sort of there's a battle kind of that is going on then. We sort of have been asking readers and reviewers as to what would they like to see in a paper. And things that have sort of come across us is that they do want to see the paper to be very tightly integrated with the code and the data. So for instance, if there is a concept in the paper, then it should be possible to look at how that concept was implemented within the source code. If there is a data set, then it should be linked to the metadata and or a DOI over there. If there's a figure, then I should be able to derive that figure, how the figure was done. And if there are some data values, then I should be able to go exactly to the exact location where it was referenced in the PDF. And that's very much for the policy papers. That's what readers want to do. Well, all this is good, and you can sort of have a nice paper. And these are sort of some examples which are being there in the research domain, where people are sort of creating these nice digital readers where you have a paper, and then you can produce some kind of regression model you can run over there, and I mean, all this is good, but this creates a lot of author burden that you have to make your paper in a nice formatted version and make it sort of nicely available for readers. So the question that sort of arose in my mind was that what do authors have to do to be able to produce this nice paper? It looks nice, it can reproduce, it can repeat, but what do authors have to do? So they have to first do a transformation, which is they have to take each of these code or data or execution and transform them into a form amenable to linkage with the paper. So this implies that I should be able to associate some kind of classes and functions in the source code with some particular URL. I should be able to record my data sets in all the registries and access methods. I should be able to, if I've used a workflow, then I should be able to wrap it in a particular web service and make it available for users to be able to use it. And then I should be able to provide an infrastructure where I should be able to run the whole thing. So these are some basic elements that the author has to do to be able to get that nice paper. And then possibly when the person is writing, I mean, that never happens like, in a very sequential form. You're writing, you're doing a little bit of the coding. So you have to manage all these, like, what particular science object did I create, and where did I create? So you have to manage all those URLs that you're creating. And that can get pretty unwieldy after some time if you're doing it at a finer granularity. And then if I'm clicking, then I should be able to get an adequate representation. Well, we think the problem is, I mean, further than that. It's just not author burden which comes through in improving readability. I mean, if you are doing this transformation management and adequate representation, that's sort of simple, automation that one has to do to be able to take away that author burden. One needs to be able to simplify that process, make it easier so that much of these tasks are not done by the authors, but are done by some other components, which can understand and make a good representation of the paper right away. So we need to simplify these associations of data, code, and execution to the paper. We should be able to create some kind of a bibliography where all the URIs that the person is creating are automatically stored. So just like I use a bibliography in the paper right now, I put a tag and I have I put a keyword and I have the reference along with it. I should be able to just get through my keyword the particular science object or particular code or data that I have created and be able to use in my paper when I'm writing. But that's for the author. For the reader, when the person clicks, then you need some kind of efficient representation of the same thing. And it should be just like, whether it's executing locally or whether it's executing remotely, the performance should be same. And I mean, the paper should be like, we should not be taking away the readability metaphor, that has been so far there in the PDFs. It should be exactly like that. Otherwise, people will not be able to adopt. Authors would not adopt these tools, and readers would not be reading these papers this way. I mean, there is this whole sort of aspect of attribution, which is like, what is the incentive for authors and to do this? And I sort of totally understand that that's a very important measure, but we also think that there are researchers who are interested in doing reproducible science, and I mean, the thing that is limiting them is the lack of appropriate computational tools. And if they are available, they would be ready to adopt it very much. So with that sort of frame in mind, we created this Soleil system, which is science objects and linking, with the sort of whole thing of giving publication as a service. And the basic idea is to provide tools to authors to be able to associate these science objects. I'll sort of give more depth into that with the publications. But the idea is to associate code, data, and execution with publications. And then support it with a publication infrastructure that can host interactivity so that the readers find it easy to access the papers. And we are hoping that with such an infrastructure, it can improve the transparency of the process. People can repeat or reproduce with their own modules as well. So very sort of quickly, this is sort of the rough architecture that the authors sort of associate PDFs, source codes, executions, create science objects, put it on a cloud, and then you have a sort of interactive publication display. And the important thing are two things, like there are two important things: science objects, which the author creates, and the way that the reader interacts with the particular science objects. So the reader may have an intention of what he or she might want to do with that particular. He might want to just repeat, might want to reproduce, which is, not repeat is exactly running the same code. Reproduce is I want to put in my own module and then run with the same data set possibly. I want to reference, so go to particular citations which have more details with respect to that, just not a plain bibliographic citation. May want to sort of reuse, so download a particular code or data set, so reuse in that form. And reveal is that they want to sort of see what are the particular features or inputs and outputs that people have associated with the workflows. Okay, so these are sort of interactions that I sort of just explained, that we want to be able to reuse, share the data, or a particular method or a particular process. Repeat and reproduce and reference are I think very obvious, and reveal is be able to sort of validate a particular result and get some kind of reviewers to be looking into it. So so the next important thing is a science object, and these are created by authors. So yeah, we are putting a little bit of burden on the authors to be able to create this, and our idea is that we'll just ask authors to tag their source codes with particular keywords, and if they are tagged, then we will interpret what that tag means and start a particular process which would sort of interpret what is in between the tag and find its data type, upload it to a particular website, associate a URI with it, and then if an execution needs to be done on that part that the author has tagged, instantiate on a particular cloud computing infrastructure, and then the reader can execute it. So I'll give you some examples of how we have used this approach in executing workflows and source code. So this is an example of a source code tagging. So you sort of start with an open tag format, and you have a closed tag. You can name multiple tags for the same thing. Like in this case, we are naming like init, setup, import, working directory, anything that the author has in mind that this code might be useful for describing later in the paper, that word can be put. There could be nested tags. So for instance, this particular part is a dataset directory, and this word might come up later in the paper. So the author has used that. So this is sort of how the tagging appears. What we do is we sort of look at these tags, and these are the key value pairs, which sort of we interpret the tag and sort of put them as keys, which are the tag numbers. This is dangerous, really. And so, then once you've done the tagging, so this is what author has identified, and we run sort of the author runs a particular script, and that creates the key value pairs. It creates that, okay, this is the file in which this tag was there. This is the start point. This is the end point, and sort of takes the particular code that was there, and it creates what we call is a science object. So this is stored in a database, and then the author can come back. So this is I'll sort of show this a little bit more in detail, but this is the interface that we have right now. And in the middle we are seeing the paper. When the author logs into this sort of system, the author sees the science objects that the author has created. So for instance, over here a particular aggregate object has been created. So aggregate would come in over here. And then, so these are all the science objects that are in the namespace of the author. And then you can select the word, and then on the very sort of right hand side, you can sort of say the same tag, and then you would retrieve the particular value that is associated with that key. And then you can associate that, okay, aggregate means this particular code over here. So that was for source code. What we do for annotation, so you have a PDF file. Now you can select sort of, like all PDF readers support, you can select a region. And then again, you can put a tag, and then you put in words over here as to what you want to describe. So this is a table that would come, that has been sort of leveraged. This is a table that was in another paper, and the author was using this table as a classification means. So this was input data. And he sort of says that this is the classification scheme of this MLCT data. And we run the script. All the annotations that were there are taken care of, and they are put as science objects in the in the repository. What is more interesting is the workflow. So these are static objects that one can create. One wants to create execution objects as well. So this is a workflow input. So the author again describes that this is an input, and has to give a data type for what is the input. And you can give multiple data types. Over here it's stiff. You can give the tag again reclassification. You can describe your software units, and we will find out that which software units combine with each other. We would ask for verification that are your inputs and outputs the way we think should be there, but we do that sort of matching. You can give some matching in the sense if you put it with the same tag, that makes our task simpler in matching the inputs to the outputs. So this is a software unit tag, and that's one unit of the workflow. Again, you can have nesting over here. You could give inputs and outputs. These are, again, inputs and outputs. Both things can be associated. And this is another software unit, which is calculate. So this is how tagging happens in workflow. And so now I'll show that when you would get this particular reclassification is a tag that comes up in the Soleil interface. And these are some other workflows that the user has created, like algorithm, MLCT data, or calculate. Now, what happens is that, that's how the association is happening. You select the word, you look for the particular word, several tags would come up which match the word MLCT, and you choose the one that you want to do, that you want to associate. So this is for the workflow. And so as we see that the author has described an algorithm, and it says prepare MLCT data, the project to these coordinates, reclassify, calculate. So there is a workflow that is associated over here. And you sort of click on reclassify, and I've sort of missed that step of finding reclassify. And once the association is made, you get a particular, you sort of given all the attributes. These are the inputs, outputs, and a URI. If you click on that URI, then you would say that you would get that you can run this particular workflow, and essentially, so this sort of uses, sort of takes the meta description of inputs and outputs, and sort of puts that as configuration files in the Galaxy system, and then you can run the workflow from a Galaxy installed instance where it interprets what are the inputs and outputs. We'll show you. I'll come to that. We have a demo where we can show, and this basically you run the workflow, and it says successfully run the workflow. Now over here in this step 1, actually if you click, then you have all the inputs and outputs that I showed you earlier, and you can change the data as well. You can upload your own data. You can use any other sort of data set that you want to test it with. So this is with respect to computational papers that we've done, and as I showed you for policy papers, the PDF annotation, how we can sort of select and associate science objects. The third kind of papers that I had shown you, which is the data mining papers. So what we are right now doing for them is that we're saying that if you're really interested in giving a data set description in the paper, then instead of sort of just giving the data set, we'll have a plugin which sort of is installed in the Microsoft in a Firefox browser right now. It can be extended to any browser, but right now it's Firefox. And when you are clicking on the website, we will sort of capture all your traversals of the links. So there is a particular sort of lineage that the author has used to come to that particular data set. So with those, we capture the traversal of the links, and then we make that as a science object. So you have the data set, and you have the history of how the data set was obtained. What the user sees is search terms that the author has used to come to that particular data set, and any important URLs in the step. So there might be some jobs that might have run in between. There might have been some sort of access to some transient sort of resources in between, because these are large data sets. And so we can't capture the whole sort of thing, because things might have expired, might have been sort of thrown away from the digital repository cache. So what we do is capture the important URLs in the step and associate that with the paper. So, I would like to sort of describe a little bit of what we are thinking about the science objects as, that they sort of have these features of sort of doing a particular action, or being they need to be visualized, they need to be printed, and they need to be interacted. And we need to sort of take care of the science objects in all these ways before we can say that we have a reproducible paper. So yeah, these are some sort of internal commands as to what happens when a science object is initiated. Maybe we can leave this. So yeah, we have the most important thing is a demo, which is at 4:30. The session starts at 4:30, and we have, in fact, 3 papers, slightly out. So that we have a computational paper, we have a policy paper, and we have PubChem papers, exactly where we can show how we are doing this association of science objects. So that's sort of the conclusion that, I think that this sort of reproducible science is going to become increasingly more and more important, and authors would need tools to be able to do it easily. NSF is having a data management plan, a software management plan, and you do want, people do want their data and software to be used. Increasingly, if we are putting citation, a DOI, and that is being cited, authors do want sort of credit for that, and if they are doing some work, how can we make it efficient? That's the way we are thinking. Cloud computing is very important, and we are going to sort of listen about that how it can help in doing reproducible science. So we are using some of these tools, FluidInfo for storing our key value pairs, Globus Online for moving the data sets in these papers from the author's repository to the infrastructure. We are using Galaxy for doing our workflows management, and we are using the Amazon Web Services for the actual execution environment. And we are hoping that would produce a more reproducible paper. Thank you. Okay, so back to a very interesting talk.
We hope, yes. So we'll see. Thank you. I've got my own mic.
Yes.
So thank you. Did we acknowledge Quan at the back? So you should.
Yes.
He's the person who did the work, and
yes, Boon did most of the work.
So thank you. So we're gonna shift gears here. I'm gonna talk a bit about, as we say here, cloud-based services for science. And I'm going to touch upon issues of reproducibility, but I'd like to bring to bear a few perspectives on why I think cloud-based services are important, and perhaps some perspectives that are different than those you hear from at least some people in this field. So let's see if this is working. Skip over that. So we're all familiar with cloud, right? There's probably half a dozen talks in this conference on how we can use so-called infrastructure as a service, the likes of Azure, I remember to say that first, and Microsoft, and Amazon and so forth. What I'm going to be talking about here is mostly how we might be able to use software as a service and platform as a service capabilities for science. And I think this the work I'll talk about is motivated in part by the so-called data deluge, but also I think driven by the demands of reproducible science. I always like this picture. This is the physicists here, the social scientists over here. They're not quite wet yet, but that is coming. And I guess this is an old picture, so the biologists by now are quite wet, as we know, because of course, in biology, data volumes have exploded by orders of magnitude over the last few years. This is stately old Moore's law here, and this is sequencing machine throughput, which I think is actually accelerating at this point in time. And of course, things are made worse by the fact that everyone wants to have a sequencing machine, even people in New Zealand down there. Okay, so point a few other slides, because we don't have too much time, point out that it's not just sequencing machines. I work at a national lab where we run high-energy X-ray sources, and this is a similar sort of picture showing the brilliance, the number of photons generated by X-ray sources, which again is totally outstripping the Moore's law increases in computing power. So sensors in general are overwhelming our capabilities. So, and of course, if we look at what's going on in the world of science, well, big science, I would say, has been fairly successful in creating infrastructures that are able to make sense of very large amounts of data. For example, our friends in high-energy physics, for whom I've spent far too many hours, they build systems that can deal with hundreds of terabytes per second of data and produce publications with hundreds of authors per square inch, and in the process, manage and manipulate very large quantities of data. On the other hand, small and medium science is suffering. So these are a couple of pictures which I view as sort of somewhat representative. So this is the lab of a colleague of mine, a physicist, a very smart physicist with very sophisticated. On the other side of his lab, he's got $1 million lasers. So he's a rich physicist. But this is his data management solution. I think the orange is there to stop people stealing the data or something. And then this is a list of all of the passwords that you need to access, that you need to maintain to manage the dark energy survey database. So a new user gets added to all of these lists of things. So small and this is the state of the art, I think, for small and medium science. Tycho Brahe a few hundred years ago had his notebook, and he spent decades collecting a few data points. Now we have terabytes here, and the new detectors at the X-ray source where this data was collected will generate hundreds of terabytes. And these are the authors these are the researchers who are struggling to do good science. They're also struggling, I think, because many of them do care about reproducibility, to think how are they going to document their work in a way that will make sense to others, and how are they going to make progress at a reasonable rate. So sometimes this term long tail science is used. This is a sort of a fun picture generated by Brian Hydorn a few years ago. This is ranked. This is NSF grants ordered by grant size. The smallest actually goes off the edge here. I think the smallest shown here is a few $100s. The title of the paper in which he presents this is Dark Data in the Long Tail of Science. He observes that, well, these are the high-energy physicists, these are the climate scientists, these are probably some biologists. They all have enough resources to at least conceivably do a decent job of managing their data, documenting their publications, etc. But these guys down here with a few thousand, hundreds of thousands or thousands of dollars are not able to do that. So how are we going to meet the needs of these people? So to use another popular term, we've got good infrastructure for the 1%, but not for the 99%. So how are we going to meet their needs? And that's an area that we've been focusing on for some time. And one thing I like to observe is that you can, if you're in business, this problem doesn't arise. You can run a business from a coffee shop. Maybe this guy is here. And the reason you're able to do that is you can outsource most business functions to third-party so-called cloud providers. So what would it mean to do the same thing for get rid of these piles of disks and outsource the IT activities involved with research to third-party providers, to so-called cloud providers? So what are these functions? Well, so this is, along here we've got communicate with colleagues, publish papers. Those are some of the things that we just heard about. There are a whole range of other things that one has to do in order to perform research. Write reports and order supplies, write proposals is probably where we spend most of our time, in fact, unfortunately, but we like to think that we spend our time publishing papers and doing other things. So to quote Whitehead, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking of them. So how many of these operations can we outsource in a similar manner? So this is sort of a schematic of how we see the world of science, somewhat simplistic, or actually very simplistic, but it actually matches well quite a wide range of science projects, whether experimental, observational, simulation-based data being created in increasingly large volumes, passed through various physical or logical pipelines where it's ingested, analyzed, annotated, registered, shared, archived, mirrored, etc. And somewhere along the way here, these people, or maybe this guy here, is this gal, I should say, is writing a paper about the activity, and they want to be able to put that paper somewhere where it allows you to capture and therefore understand, and perhaps in some cases reproduce, the processes that were followed to get from the simulation or experimental observation to the ultimate published result. So this is a sort of a schematic of what I sometimes think of ourselves as doing is, we've built cloud infrastructures for a long time, grid infrastructures for a long time, which are what high-energy physicists and other big science projects use to perform large-scale data analysis. Meanwhile, another community has built systems that actually provide incredibly sophisticated capabilities to millions. For example, Netflix, which provides real-time video delivery, right, to millions of, tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of people at this point, without any local software installation, Gmail, Salesforce, etc. So we're sort of interested in combining the two together to create what we might call the research cloud. And the first service of this sort that we put up, which is actually somewhat relevant to reproducible research, but only somewhat, and I'll come to other things that are more relevant, is the Globus Online Data Movement Service. And if you open up globusonline.org, or if you're European, globusonline.eu, you'll see this ticking over, which is sort of fun. But it's basically a service, a cloud service, which, like Gmail does email for you, Globus Online Transfer manages this just one very mundane, simple, you might say, task of moving data from one place to another. A task that in science actually ends up often being a rather time-consuming process, something that it's amazing how many graduate students and postdocs can say they've spent hours, days, even weeks of their lives managing data transfer processes. It's a cloud-based service that actually runs, I hate to say this here, but on Amazon computers. But the data flow is typically from a sequencing center to a supercomputer center, from a sequencing center to a lab, a supercomputer center to someone's lab, etc. Wherever people need to move small, medium, or large amounts of data. With a Web 2.0 interface managing or hiding or providing convenient access to all of the complexity. So this is the sort of thing that people like to do with it. So here's Lattice QCD people seem to have nothing better to do with their time than consume unlimited amounts of computing. They do produce a lot of data as well, and they regularly move many terabytes of data, 6 terabytes in 2 days, which actually is, at the time it impressed us. It's no longer a particularly impressive amount. Someone just finished moving a petabyte yesterday from one storage system to another. But the point is that this is a task that they are able to hand off from the person who would normally have had to manage it to a third-party service that then performs it on their behalf. The National Energy Research Supercomputer Center, NERSC, recommends Globus Online to all of its users as the way to move data in and out of their facility. The users get convenient, intuitive interface, high performance, and NERSC no longer has to handhold their many users who previously were complaining all the time about how slow SCP was or how unreliable some other tool was. Well, Blue Waters uses it. We now have a European site, etc. So for us, Globus Online Data Transfer was just a experiment to see what would be involved in a academic group, if you like, taking on the task of delivering a useful service to very large numbers of users. So far we're up to 6,000, so that's not a large number, but it's a reasonable number, with this capability delivered as a service hosted on cloud hardware. And I think our experience has been that the learning curve was steep in getting from we're used to providing software to people that they then install and run. We had to learn how to create software that could be run in one place with very high reliability, at least 3 nines reliability, so only a few minutes downtime at a time. It was also an experiment in what the user response would be to this sort of software, and I think our experience has been that it's been incredibly positive. So I think maybe because especially younger users are used to software working like this software does, because they use Netflix and Gmail and everything else, Twitter and Facebook and so forth. It wasn't a surprise that it should be like this, but it was a surprise, I think, that scientific software could be as easy to use as this software was. Okay, so I'll skip over this. Skip that. So what's this got to do with reproducible publications? Well, I think in general, hosted services are a way of relieving a whole series of research burdens, but in particular, the burdens that were referred to relating to authorship. So we can use them to store data, code, and workflows. We can use them to host and perform computations on people's behalf. We can use them to maintain bindings among data, code, et cetera, as Tanu just referred to. And if we do these things right, we can do them in a way that is far more reliable than anything that we might expect at any individual institution or research lab. So I'd like to now take a quick aside and point out that we're certainly not the only ones exploring this use of cloud computing as a way of delivering not computing power but software capabilities. So here's a few. My Experiment, a tool for, we have the esteemed Ms. My Experiment in the room here, a tool for sharing scientific workflows. NanoHub, a tool for sharing access to nano science simulation tools. MGRAST, which this is a rather out-of-date slide, but has got, I think, now more than 50,000 metagenomes that have been uploaded for analysis. In a sense, providing a form of reproducible science. If your metagenome is analyzed using MGRAST, well, you can, if you like, download the code and examine it, but you can know that the same methods were used for your code as were for someone else's. Hosted SQL database, the SQL share system, the iPlant Collaborative, which is providing a range of data analysis tools as services. And we had a talk this morning in another workshop here on Run My Code, Victoria Stodden's system, which she's developing in collaboration with people in France, which is intended to make it easy to upload particularly economics code and then allow people to invoke it and interact with it. I don't think you can upload climate models unless they're very simple two-equation climate models. Okay, so these are all examples, I think, of things where people are basically moving complexity out of the lab, extracting it and starting to make it available as cloud services. And I think this, for me, this is an incredibly exciting direction. I think as we work out how to make this really scale and work out what services are needed, we're going to see, potentially a transformation of how we do science. I think it's something that is very democratizing because not everyone can become an SQL expert, but many people can log online and work out how to create an SQL database using SQL share. Similarly, for each of the other examples I've shown here, I've had these wonderful conversations with people in the US and Mexico and elsewhere who I have nothing to do with the service, but I know the authors who say, this has changed my life. I would have had to go to school for a year, buy a bunch of equipment before I could do genome sequence analysis. Now I can just upload the sequence and get the result back. So potentially very powerful effect on who can do science, and I think also potentially an advantage in this in terms of this reproducibility issue. So I've had a number over the years, a number of unpleasant for me experiences with scientists where I really wanted to document their procedures, and after a few weeks, sometimes months, realized that they actually had no idea of what process they used to get a result. They'd written a computation here, a bit of a spreadsheet here, a bit of a script over here. These had all long disappeared into the weeds of their computational infrastructure. So they themselves had no idea of whether their result was valid or not. Sort of a scary scary situation. So these systems like this, I think, can improve on that. Anyway, so we meanwhile, of course, this high-level goal of reproducible research. We meanwhile are focusing on the very mundane aspects of data-intensive research. I mentioned transfer, moving data from one place to another. Let me mention a few other aspects of this end-to-end pipeline that I started off with, and talk a bit about some of the platform as a service mechanisms that we're providing. So these, just to sort of drill down a little bit on these cloud terms. So software as a service is a piece of software that you might otherwise run on your desktop. You don't need to because it's run somewhere else. It could be a mail server, a customer relationship management server, that's Salesforce, or a data movement management service, that's Globus Transfer. Platform as a service is a set of capabilities that provide tools that many different services may require to execute. And we've got a set of services now that we're starting to provide things like federated user identities, profiles, and groups, because it turns out quite a few researchers spend a lot of their time as they use remote resources, struggling with issues of identities, profiles, groups. Remember that picture of all the password sites that had to be configured in the. This was actually the Dark Energy Survey was the example. Data, computation, and collaboration management. The Globus Integrate platform provides REST APIs for managing all of these things. So these are things that our publication service will make use of. So a couple of examples. The Dark Energy Survey uses Globus Online to manage its data movement using this REST API. They also expect to use our identities and groups. Earth System Grid does the same thing for data movement. The DOE Science Knowledge Base is starting to use this platform for its identity group and data management functions. So in this case, in fact the last three cases, there's no direct connection to, none of them are about generating interactive publications, except that because you're outsourcing these functions to a third-party service, it's very easy to document and then replicate a function that's performed as part of an end-to-end pipeline. And I'll say a few more words about the use of Galaxy, which Tanu referred to. So we're using this as one of a number of tools that we employ for pipeline automation. We've also made use of Taverna. And we see here a particularly fine or maybe overcomplicated example of PowerPoint art. So in genome sequence analysis, which is where we're mostly using this, but also in computational economics and satellite data analysis, where we're also making use of it. A typical research lab or research task involves interacting with many different resources. So we basically expose those resources all as Globus Online endpoints, and then drive the required data movement operations and the associated computations using a mix of Galaxy pipelines and Globus Online services. Okay, I think so. What else happens? Yep. Okay, that's it. So thank you for your attention. Sort of just to recap, reproducible research, I think, well, I was talking to someone last week from a pharmaceutical company who said he reckoned that no more than 10% of university wet lab research is reproducible for various reasons. Mistakes, bad documentation, things. So, of course, we should aspire to do better, maybe 11%, or maybe even 12. In fact, we can do much better for computational research because, we don't, everything, is a matter of bits. The challenge we face, this is not a problem I think that people have not solved before because of lack of effort. It's a very hard problem. Computation is a very ill-defined, complex activity. I think that cloud resources, the ability to outsource certain tasks to third party, offers potential for reducing complexity in some cases. Of course, we've got to strike the right balance. If we outsource things to black boxes, we haven't made things more reproducible. Arguably, we've made them less reproducible. But I think there is potential there for reducing complexity and therefore increasing people's interest in capturing the activities that they're involved in. So thank you very much. Yes, please.
So I think one of the problems with cloud services is how to get people to pay for them, how to get clients to pay for them. And, for services outside science, advertising and then it's premium where you get something for free, but you pay more for the pro version. Now you seem to have cracked it for your science service because you said you've got a subscription model. So how easy was it to get people to actually start to subscribe and pay for your service?
Summarize just briefly.
Yeah. So the question was, how does one address sustainability of cloud services? And you mentioned that you said I mentioned that we had a subscription model. So I don't remember mentioning that, but it is something that we want to pursue. So the way that people make cloud services work in other contexts, as you say, is by advertising, which I don't think will work for us unless scientists develop more expensive tastes than they do today. And so we're left with either fee per service or freemium models. So we want to, in fact, we have some NSF funding to pursue both approaches. We are already, we're running some applications for computational biologists who are quite happy to pay for the use of cloud computing services and cloud storage services. So that seems a promising direction. I think they are also quite happy to pay some amount of money for someone to run their pipelines for them. For the Globus online data transfer service, we're exploring the idea of the basic service continues to be free, but some more sophisticated service, for example, those that run between from laptop to laptop, from workstation to workstation, would be $100 a year or some other fee. So we'll see how that works. I have no idea. There's actually a big thrust in the US under the aegis of the Internet 2 project, their so-called Net Plus initiative, where they're trying to provide a wide range of services to campuses, with the campuses being the potential customer. But yes, scientists don't like paying for stuff, except many of us have MATLAB or Mathematica licenses, which we pay for. And of course, many of us use Microsoft Office, which we pay for. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so so the question is, are we talking about reproducing a scientific experiment or the data analysis activity? And I think, in a sense, the question is, how far do you take? A scientific paper will, typically, will describe in some rough terms, what an entire process from, it could be, let's say, an experiment that runs a simulation and then compares the results of the simulation with some experimental data. There'll be some equations describing the model that is being implemented. They'll describe the implementation of that model, and then they'll describe maybe a set of manipulations that were applied to the raw data to get it into a form in which it can be compared with the simulation. And typically, if you read the paper, there isn't enough information in there for someone else to replicate those activities. We'd like our reproducible papers to be able to capture that entire process. But still, the data that you work with, so one of the papers that Tanu talked about, we're working with some data from the some satellite image data, and that data has already been manipulated by others before we get to it, and so we're not taking ourselves necessarily all the way back to the raw signal information. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So there is a question that you need to do the linking between the raw data after data set that's used by scientists. But this linking also needs to include or address this kind of the intermediate time of doing research that will be quite what's very much private, very confidential.
Yeah. Okay.
And this creates a lot of concepts. Actually need to redefine properly in different ways the data life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Produce this reliable or secure building of data, and so on.
Yeah, I think so this idea of reproducible research, the notion that you capture all the information required to replicate the results of a paper is, I think, it's a goal, and one can work towards it in various ways. And there can be various obstacles to achieving that goal. One may be that the raw data that you're working with is not publicly accessible for some reason. For example, medical data. I mean, it may not be movable. That's another. Although that doesn't prevent you from documenting the methods. Now, you raised another issue, which is that the computational methods that people apply may be proprietary in some manner. And if that is the case, then presumably, one might be skeptical of the results of such a scientific paper when you're not able to reproduce it in any way. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So this part of selection of data for the intermediate, for the
Yeah.
research should be confidential. But final data used for the paper actually should be exposed to the raw data.
I see. It's interesting at the moment, there's a whole set of studies being published by the likes of Facebook and Google, which are not reproducible by anyone because people don't have access to the data they use to produce those results. Yeah.
So, and just a question, at the moment you're using the Amazon infrastructure, and I'm not sure there's any local Amazon infrastructure in Australia, for example, which would mean that data files transferred between endpoints in Australia would go to the United States and back, or possibly wherever the nearest AWS infrastructure is located. Just wondering how we can sort of get round that problem, or,
Well, thanks for asking that. So, because I wanted to just clarify that we don't move any data in and out of Amazon infrastructure. We run the control logic, if you like, in Amazon. And so we have quite a few users in Australia for that reason. But I would imagine that for research, other research usage, you're going to need some cloud infrastructure in Australia. I think, isn't Cyro setting some up for, yeah. Right.
So the other question, just following up, is provenance, around provenance. I mean, will your service add any information to the transfer of the data, or are you going to rely on the users to handle that?
Yeah, no, well, I'd say at the moment we're taking steps in that direction. Once you have some degree of centralized perspective on what's happening, then it's easier to assign names to things and track the movement of things from one place to another. There's still the question of how you record that provenance information and where you record it. I mean, a lot of people are thinking about that, I think. In the context of the reproducible publications, I think in a sense, the publication starts to become a record of the provenance of the data as it is produced. Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. Yep.